Hi, it's me, Brodie McLeod, again with another one of my banal, sometimes quite topically interesting, but ultimately very unsuccessful YouTube videos. I want to talk today about the objective, subjective nature of justice, not just criminal justice, but social justice, and the idea that there's a kind of a magnate is completely the wrong word. There's a kind of a propensity to draw conclusions based on our own lived experience rather than objective facts, science, statistics, and logic and reason. And whilst that doesn't deny the nature of something being ultimately wrong, my ex-girlfriend got me a book when we split up. It was called In Defense of the Enlightenment. Don't ask me who it was by, but buy a copy of it, it's good. There's a great quote in there. It says that you don't need to, using the law to determine right from wrong is like trying to look at a perfect circle and to ask whether its angles add up to 360 because you don't have a protractor. It's a great quote. You know, sometimes things are just circular. If you just do something and you know what you're doing is utterly wrong, you don't need anybody to tell you about that. You don't need scripture or religion or anything to tell you how that works. But people who refer to those things, fair play to you, because most of them all say the same bloody thing, don't they? They all say, be good, be nice, don't hurt people, be forgiving and kind and benevolent, beneficent, and you know, everything will be all right, be living in heaven. If you go around lying and cheating and stealing and behaving like a cunt, then you will find that you live probably, not necessarily, but probably in quite a hellish kind of situation. I'm just going to move this influencing bollocks stand thing so I get a slightly better point of view for not my moral judgment but just my reading. You can have a look at my bathroom door there with a waterfall on it. That's nice, isn't it? It's a magnetic one. It's made out of some weird soft stuff. I'm also going to find my vape, which is on the floor. Very unprofessional videography here. But then I'll only get 10 views, so who gives any fucks? On that note, let's read the research and get this hell over with, shall we? Oh, my phone's fallen out of the fucking thing again. Okay. I use the example of ecstasy tablets being, for some people, something they would consider to be very dangerous, and to other people, completely safe. And I think that mirrors our own kind of moral, objective, subjective fallibility. And I asked it to comment. I haven't actually read it yet. I'll just do it kind of on the fly in one take, these videos. But yeah, like the jury system being fucked off and also Professor David not having been fucked off are two bad things for all of us who love taking drugs, because drugs are really nice. They're actually really important for people who build roads and schools and hospitals and businesses and nightclubs and bars and cafes and restaurants and racetracks and golf courses and holiday homes and fucking car parks and God knows, you know, it's a huge industry that kind of lubricates our society in ways that I'm not qualified to really explain to you, but you can read lots of books about. Anyway, let's get this open. So it's entitled The Scales of Perspective, MDMA, Alcohol, and the Subjective Apportionment of Justice in the United Kingdom. The introduction reads, The Philosophy of Five Pills and the Illusion of Absolute Justice. So the apportionment of justice is frequently depicted in the public consciousness as a blindfolded pursuit, an uncompromising application of codified absolutes where criminal actions meet their equal and opposite legal reactions. In this traditional framework, the law is perceived as a monolith built upon the bedrock of empirical truth, societal consensus, and universal morality. However, when this monolithic structure is subjected to the intricate, often contradictory pressures of lived experience, scientific anomaly, and profound societal bias, it reveals itself to be profoundly malleable. To truly understand the subjective nature of moral and ethical justice, one must examine the uncharted territories where objective science and visceral human tragedy collide. There is perhaps no better metaphysical crucible for this than the exploitation than the societal, legal and personal perspective surrounding the recreational drug 3,4-methylene-dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, particularly when its legal and moral standing is juxtaposed against the cultural ubiquity of alcohol. Consider a thought-provoking journalistic trope, a scenario that meticulously exposes the fault lines of ethical jurisprudence. A 19-year-old university student, right, for example, perhaps studying law and standing on the precipice of a promising professional career, is arrested outside a nightclub. Upon a routine search, the student's found in possession of 5 ecstasy pills intended for personal consumption and to be shared among a small group of friends. Under the United Kingdom's Misuse of Drug Tax 1971, this individual faces a potential charge of possession with intent to supply Class A substance. The legal apparatus demands that a punishment be apportioned, and the sentencing guidelines for such an offence can range from community orders up to 16 years in prison, with a theoretical maximum of life in prison. The state demands that a just punishment be enacted, but what constitutes justice in this specific scenario? The answer isn't mathematically derived from the text of a statute, but rather depends entirely on the lived experience and the circumstantial narrative of the entity passing judgment. If one were to ask a grieving parent who's tragically lost a child to an idiosyncratic fatal reaction to a contaminated ecstasy pill, the only morally sound answer might be that the arrested teenager should serve 5 consecutive life sentences. In the eyes of those who have experienced the absolute devastation of drug-related mortality, each of those 5 pills is tantamount to a loaded chamber in a game of Russian roulette. Each pill possesses the demonstrated kinetic capacity to end a life, to sever a family lineage, and to inflict insurmountable lifelong suffering. It would not only be insensitive but profoundly tactless and inappropriate to attest that this perception is in any way invalid. Their reality is forged in the absolute, irrefutable finality of death, making their demand for ultimate retribution a completely valid ethical stance. Conversely, if the same question were posed to a high-level illicit drug supplier, an individual who's perhaps manufactured and distributed 1 million ecstasy pills a month for a decade without ever witnessing or hearing of a single fatality among their vast clientele, the ethical calculus shifts drastically. To this supplier, these substances merely a highly lucrative, overwhelmingly safe recreational commodity. They perceive themselves not as purveyors of death, but as unlicensed businessmen fulfilling a societal demand. This dramatic dichotomy forces a direct confrontation with the object scientific perspective championed by leading psychopharmacologists and former government advisors. Exhaustive scientific analysis, including comprehensive trials and findings presented to the British government, have concluded that the substance within those 5 pills, while not entirely devoid of health risks, is demonstrably less harmful to the individual and to society than a glass of Chardonnay. Alcohol, too, claims tens of thousands of lives through extremely rare anecdotal acute poisonings and chronic systemic devastation. Yet, a capacitous responsible adult purchasing 5 bottles of wine is viewed as a patron of commerce, while the student with 5 pills is prosecuted as a severe threat to public safety. This juxtaposition leaves modern jurisprudence in uncharted territory. Both the grieving parent and the empirical scientist hold perfectly valid points regarding exactly the same issue, and they're forged from their own genuine, incontrovertible lived experiences, even when those perspectives seem to fly in the face of opposing science and physics. This comprehensive report explores this precise intersection by examining the empirical data surrounding MDMA and alcohol fatalities, the socio-legal mechanisms of punishment, political frameworks for safe societal integration, and the recent structural shifts in the UK judicial system, specifically the highly controversial removal of jury service for certain offences in 2026. This analysis demonstrates that justice, though purported to be absolute, is fundamentally a subjective narrative. So the pharmacological reality and the ACMD findings. To dissect the subjective nature of justice in relation to MDMA, it's essential to first establish the objective scientific baseline that governs the substance. So the pharmacology of MDMA characterises it as primarily as a serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine releasing agent and a reuptake inhibitor. When consumed, it induces profound feelings of euphoria, emotional warmth, empathy towards others, and enhanced sensory perception. While it undoubtedly carries acute physiological risks, most notably hypothermia, hyponatremia, that's water intoxication caused by excessive drinking without electrolyte replenishment, and serotonin syndrome, the inherent biological toxicity of pure MDMA is relatively low when compared to many other widely used recreational substances. So the friction between this pharmacological reality and the legal framework reached a critical juncture in the late 2000s. The UK government tasks the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, ACMD, then chaired by the eminent neuropharmacologist Professor David Nutt, to conduct a comprehensive evidence-based review of drug harms. The objective was to inform the national policy and ensure that the classification of drugs became accurately reflected in relation to their dangers to the public. The methodology used by the scientific committee was rigorously objective. They employed multi-criteria decision analysis, a sophisticated modelling approach designed to evaluate complex multidimensional problems. Members of the independent scientific community on drugs conveyed to score 20 different substances against 16 distinct criteria. These criteria were evenly divided, right? So 9 related to the direct harms the drug produces in the individual user, right? So things like drug-specific mortality, drug-related mortality, and dependence, and 7 of them related to the collateral harms inflicted upon others and broader society, such as crime, environmental damage, and economic cost. The findings of this exhaustive trial were a paradigm shift that fundamentally challenged the established legal and moral order of the United Kingdom. The MCDA modelling generated a cumulative harm score out of 100 for each substance. Overall, alcohol was determined to be the most harmful drug in society by a significant margin, achieving an overall harm score of 72. Heroin followed with a score of 55 and crack cocaine with 54. Ecstasy, by stark contrast, was ranked drastically lower on the scale, scoring only an eighth of the harm attributed to alcohol. Through this structured harm assessment process, Professor David Nutt and his colleagues clearly demonstrated that the physiological and societal risks associated with MDMA were more akin to amphetamine sulfate, a Class B drug, than to crack cocaine or heroin, Class A drugs. The data indicated that if substances were classified strictly on the basis of the empirical harm they cause to the human body and the social fabric, alcohol would be unequivocally classified alongside heroin as a Class A substance, while MDMA would warrant significant downgrading. Despite these comprehensive findings presented by a team of highly credentialed experts, the political response was deeply rooted in subjective moral messaging rather than objective science. So the Home Office, under the leadership of then Home Secretary Jackie Smith, fiercely resisted the ACMD's formal review. When attempts were made to instigate a sensible discussion regarding the downgrading of MDMA, the scientific committee was met with resolute political assertions that the government would never support a downgrade of MDMA classification because, it quotes, it would give the wrong message. This reaction underscores the fundamental premise that justice and drug policy are often driven by circumstantial narratives and public perception rather than physics and biology. So the equivalency paradox and the glass of Chardonnay. To highlight the cognitive dissonance inherent in this political impasse, Professor David Nutt sought to translate the complex MCDA findings into a metaphor that the public and politicians could intuitively grasp. This effort culminated in a highly cited and deeply provocative thought piece entitled Equivalency, a harmful addiction with implications for the current debate on drug harms. In this paper, Professor David Nutt utilised epidemiological data to compare with the statistical harms of consuming ecstasy with the harms associated with a culturally accepted, legally restricted and heavily promoted activity, horse riding. He coined the term equity, an acronym. So, sorry, I had to they just do my obs there. It's supposed to be every hour, but he's just come and done them like twice in 20 minutes, which is really sound. In this paper, Professor David Nutt utilised epidemiological data to compare the statistical harms of consuming ecstasy with the harms associated with culturally accepted, legally unrestricted and heavily promoted activity, horse riding. And he coined the term equity, an acronym for equine addiction syndrome, to frame horse riding as though it were a culpable addiction. The inspiration for this comparative analysis was rooted in stark clinical reality. Nutt had recently treated a patient who had suffered irreversible catastrophic brain damage as a result of falling from her horse. When the absolute number of deaths and serious injuries were placed in context, Nutt concluded that MDMA was statistically less harmful than horse riding, particularly when riding involved inherently dangerous activities such as jumping and eventing. The paper pointed out that horse riding causes approximately 100 deaths a year, whereas at the time, deaths linked to ecstasy were around 30 a year. The ultimate extension of this logic is a comparison between MDMA and the consumption of a glass of Chardonnay. Professor David Nutt and his contemporaries have frequently noted that while ecstasy is not without risk, particularly with frequent heavy use, but the pure substance contained within the pills is demonstrably no more harmful than a glass of wine. Alcohol is a potent neurotoxin, a known carcinogen, and a substance that actively destroys brain cells and internal organs with prolonged use. It claims lives through alcohol poisoning, liver cirrhosis, and alcohol-fueled violence on a daily basis. Yet, a glass of Chardonnay is not treated as an instrument of death. It is integrated seamlessly into British society, marketed by a lifestyle product and consumed safely by millions of capacitous responsible adults. The purpose of the ecstasy and Chardonnay comparisons wasn't to trivialise illicit drug use, but to interrogate the moral apportionment of risk within the justice system. So if a society happily tolerates severe physical risks to equestrianism and actively celebrates the consumption of alcohol, why does it apportion draconian legal justice up to life imprisonment to the consumption or distribution of a statistically less harmful amphetamine derivative? Sorry, I'm fucking up the reading. I'm just on a lot of medication and it's making me dribble a bit. Not exactly, but yeah. The political establishment's reaction to this logical exercise was swift and it was punitive. Arguing that it was inappropriate to compare legal activity with an illegal one, the government dismissed David Nutt from his position as the chair of the ACMD. So they just sacked him, basically. This dismissal exemplifies the triumph of a subjective moral narrative over objective scientific physics. The British public's lived experience with alcohol, its deep cultural integration, its historical ubiquity, and the perception of its manageable risks renders society immune to the objective truths of its chemical toxicity. Conversely, the illicit nature of MDMA, coupled with highly publicised emotive tragedies, means that the drug is indelibly stamped as an existential threat. The blueprint for safe integration. So if one accepts the scientific premise that MDMA is intrinsically less harmful than alcohol, it opens the theoretical doorway to a reality where ecstasy could potentially be regulated, taxed and integrated into British society quite easily, quite safely. Advocacy groups and policy think tanks such as the Beckley Foundation have spent years mapping out precisely how this integration could occur, proving the substance out of the hands of criminal cartels, moving it, out of their hands, and into heavily regulated framework. In their comprehensive policy document, Roadmaps to Regulation, MDMA, the Beckley Foundation outlined a phased model for drug policy reform aimed at public health promotion and evidence-formed practice. So phase 1 of the roadmap advocates the immediate reform specifically to the rescheduling of MDMA from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 under the Misuse of Drugs Regulation 2001. Currently, Schedule 1 status legally defines MDMA as a substance with no therapeutic value, a designation that imposes incredibly onerous and expensive licensing requirements, acting as a near insurmountable barrier to clinical trials. By moving to phase 1, the government would decriminalise personal possession, allowing for the rapid rollout of drug testing facilities such as the Loop and harm reduction services. Phase 2 envisions strict state regulations, so the creation of a legal, heavily monitored MDMA market. This would involve a pharmacy model for licensed vendors where productions and distributions are overseen by a dedicated public authority. Pricing would be controlled, purchasing limits would be enforced to prevent hoarding or mass distribution, and marketing would be strictly prohibited. Furthermore, historical precedent demonstrates that integration can be managed. In the early 90s, when Professor David Nutt first advised the UK government on MDMA, discussions were sensible and focused on mitigation. Policy recommendations such as public education, the mandatory provision of free drinking water in nightclubs, and the establishment of chill-out rooms to prevent hypothermia were instigated and proved highly effective in reducing harm. Furthermore, modern psychiatric research has actively shifted the narrative of MDMA from brain damage to brain healing. Clinical trials, including those supported by the Beckley Foundation and MAPS, which is Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, have demonstrated MDMA's profound utility in treating treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder and helping individuals overcome alcohol dependence. In this scientifically informed paradigm, the law student caught with 5 ecstasy pills is not a criminal mastermind, but a consumer participating in an unregulated market. If the pharmacy model were adopted, those 5 pills would be of known dosage, unadulterated purity, and purchased with educational literature, rendering their consumption safer than a night of binge drinking, which he was doing probably totally legally, hypothetically. The tragedy of the anomaly. The validity of the victim's experience. However, science operates on the macro level of vast populations, standard deviations, and statistical probabilities. Humanity, conversely, operates on the micro level of individual suffering and absolute loss. While the MCDA scale, the equity paradox, and the blueprints for a regulated pharmacy model do provide a very robust objective framework for public health, they offer absolutely no solace to those who have experienced the devastating and anomalous tragedies associated with MDMA. To fully map the subjective landscape of justice, one must step out of the theoretical laboratory and into the lives of those left behind. Though statistically rare relative to the millions of doses consumed annually, deaths resulting from ecstasy consumption are a terrifying, agonising reality. The tragedy of the anomaly is characterised by its sheer unpredictability and the brutal swiftness with which it strikes. Because prohibition forces MDMA into an underground black market, users have no reliable mechanism to verify the purity, the dosage strength, or the chemical composition of the pills they're actually ingesting. So a single pill purchased outside a nightclub might contain a standard manageable 80 milligram dose of MDMA. Alternatively, it might contain a massive lethal 300 milligram dose. Worse still, it may be cut with highly toxic adulterants such as PMA, that's paramethoxyamphetamine, or PMMA, which mimic the initial effects of MDMA but possess a much higher toxicity, actively inhibiting the body's ability to regulate its core temperature and leading to fatal hypothermia. Recently, the global drug market has seen a terrifying introduction of highly potent synthetic opioids such as fentanyl and nitazines creeping into the counterfeit pills and powder supplies. These synthetic opioids can be about 500 times more potent than heroin, meaning an amount equivalent to a few grains of salt can trigger immediate fatal respiratory depression. In this unregulated environment, the slogan "one pill can kill" is not merely a piece of cautionary prohibitionist hyperbole, it's a literal forensic reality. Sorry, I can't read very well. My mouth's all fucked up with these tablets, injections and shit. Consider the tragic, well-documented cases that periodically dominate the British press. In 2013, 2 young men, Gareth Ashton, only 28, and Jordan Chambers, 19 years old, both died in Greater Manchester hospitals on consecutive days after taking contaminated heart-shaped ecstasy pills. Both were described by police as apparently fit young men who suffered sudden catastrophic physiological collapses, complaining of feeling severely unwell before succumbing to the toxins. Consider the harrowing case of a 15-year-old in Norfolk who died after becoming violently ill following the ingestion of an MDMA pill at a seaside resort. For the families of Gareth, Jordan, the young girl from Norfolk, and countless others, the academic assertion that MDMA is statistically safer than horse riding is not just intellectually hollow, it's a profound moral insult. Their lived experience is defined by an empty chair at the dinner table, a bedroom that remains untouched, and a life extinguished before its potential could be realised. When grieving, a parent looks at the hypothetical 19-year-old law student caught with the 5 MDMA pills. They do not see a victimless crime. They, don't see it as a minor public health infraction or a young person engaging in normalised youth behaviour. They see the distribution of a lethal weapon. From their subjective, entirely valid standpoint, each of those 5 pills possesses the demonstrated kinetic potential to destroy a family. So therefore, when they suggest that the arrested young person should serve 5 collective life sentences, this is not raving of an irrational mind. It's a rationally derived emotional truth based on undeniable physics of their personal reality. If the fundamental purpose of the justice system is to protect society from harm, to validate the suffering of victims, and to deter the distribution of dangerous materials, then the patient's demand for a severe, uncompromising retribution is rooted in an ethical truth that no statistical spreadsheet can negate. Their perspective reveals a non-binary nature of justice. How can a civilised society honour the objective scientific truth that a substance is generally safe on a population level, while simultaneously honouring the profound emotional and moral truth that it has caused absolute localised devastation? The impasse is profound because both realities are genuinely, undeniably factual. So then you've got this chapter here, which is entitled The Empirical Vacuum of the Supplier and the Cognitive Dissonance of Harm. To further complicate the moral geometry of this issue, one must introduce a third perspective, that one of the high-level illicit drug supplier. The clandestine trade of MDMA across Europe and the UK is a sophisticated multi-billion-pound enterprise driven by advanced chemical logistics and immense unwavering consumer demand. So a supplier operating at the apex of this market may orchestrate the synthesis, pressing and distribution of millions of ecstasy pills every month over a span of many years. From the vantage point of this high-level supplier, their lived experience is dominated by an empirical vacuum regarding harm. If a criminal organisation distributes 1 million pills a month for 10 years, amounting to 120 million individual doses of MDMA, and the supplier is entirely unaware of a single fatality directly linked to their specific product, their psychological and ethical framework adapts accordingly. To them, they're providing a highly demanded recreational commodity. They perceive themselves as entrepreneurs operating in a prohibited sector akin to a vintner, whatever the hell one of those is, might be an uncultured slob, sorry about that, managing a large-scale winery. I sold wine for LWC Drinks. I learned loads about wine, and I just don't know what a fucking vintner is. I used to have to sell bottles of wine, upsell to loads of reference from like Portsmouth and Dorset and fucking Weymouth and all across fucking Devon and South Coast. Anyway, I don't know what a fucking vintner is, sorry. Or a vintner. Anyway, this perspective creates a profound cognitive dissonance when subjected to the harsh lens of the criminal justice system. Under the UK Sentencing Council guidelines, possessions of Class A drugs with intent to supply carries offence ranges from community orders up to 16 years, with a statutory maximum of life imprisonment. The law relies heavily on the sheer quantity of the drug to determine culpability, the role of the offender, and the potential harm to the public. The supplier moving 1 million pills is universally deemed as a high-level threat, a kingpin warranting the most draconian punishments the state can muster. And yes, if one evaluates the moral culpability solely on the metric of actualised harm, as certain strands of utilitarian philosophy might suggest, the supplier's moral ledger may paradoxically appear cleaner than that of a legal alcohol distributor. As Professor David Nutt astutely noted, the failure to view drugs through the proper public health outcome, which is a survival versus death, fatally distorts our legal response. The MDMA supplier knows their product induces empathy, dancing, and social bonding because the adverse fatal events are so statistically microscopic in the grand scale of their distribution network. But these tragedies never register on their operational radar. They operate in an environment where the scale, with the science and the physics of their daily trade inform them that the product is overwhelmingly benign. Right, for some reason, I'm on like hourly obs, yeah, which means they should come and knock on my door over there approximately once an hour. They've been like 3 times in 30 minutes. And I'm just wondering why they've been 3 times in 30 minutes and how that can constitute hourly obs, but apparently they can just do it whenever they feel like it. Anyway, I'll read on. I can't remember where the fuck I got to. So if I repeat myself, I'm sorry about that. So yet, if one evaluates the moral culpability on the metric of actualised harm, as certain strands of utilitarian philosophy might suggest, the supplier's moral ledger may paradoxically appear cleaner than that of a legal alcohol distributor. As Professor David Nutt astutely noted, the failure to view drugs through the proper public health outcome, survival versus death, fatality distorts our legal response. The MDMA supplier knows their product induces empathy, dancing, and social bonding because adverse fatal events are so statistically microscopic in the grand scale of their distribution network. These tragedies never register on their operational radar. They operate in an environment where the science and physics of their daily trade inform them that the product is overwhelmingly benign. So thus society is left staring at the exact same physical object, an ecstasy pill, through 3 irreconcilable lenses. So first of all, the scientist sees a molecule with a defined, manageable physiological risk profile, scoring exceptionally low on societal harm matrices compared to alternatives like alcohol. Number 2 is the grieving parent who sees a chaotic, unpredictable instrument of death that shatters their world and demands absolute legal retribution. The supplier sees a safe, high-margin recreational commodity that brings joy to millions without causing widespread deaths. All 3 perspectives are forged from genuine, incontrovertible facts based on their circumstantial narrative. The scientist relies on macro data, the parent relies on commercial empiricism. The law, however, cannot hold 3 conflicting truths simultaneously. It must force these subjective realities through a narrow, rigid funnel of legal statute to produce a singular binary outcome, guilty or not guilty, proportionate or disproportionate sentence. The crucible of the courtroom and the crisis of the 2026 judicial reforms. This brings us back to hypothetical 19-year-old law student standing before the court with 5 MDMA pills. How does the UK legal system navigate the irreconcilable moral impasses generated by these competing lived experiences? Historically, the mechanism utilised to absorb these shocks to weigh the rigid letter of the law against the fluid conscience of the community has been the jury trial. The right to be judged by one's peers has long symbolised a fundamental democratic idea that coercive state power must be tempered by the collective morality of ordinary citizens. A jury of 12 individuals brings 12 different lived experiences into the deliberation room. Among them might be a parent who fears desperately for their children, a young person who intimately understands nightclub culture, and a professional who trusts empirical scientific data. Together they possess the unique capacity to look at the student with the 5 pills and navigate the grey areas of justice. They have the power to acknowledge that while the letter of the law indicates the intent to supply a Class A drug, their collective ethical framework dictates a lenient rehabilitative response rather than a punitive one. The concept, often touching on the fringes of jury equity and nullification, allows the community to reject the absolute rigidity of the law to achieve subjective justice. The jury acts as the ultimate shock absorber between the state's absolute mandates and the messy reality of human behaviour. However, the structural integrity of this vital process has been fundamentally threatened by recent legislative shifts in the United Kingdom. In 2025 and moving aggressively into 2026, the UK government introduced the highly controversial Courts and Tribunals Bill 2026. This legislation was birthed not from a philosophical desire to improve justice, but actually from profound calls in the crisis of infrastructure. So the criminal courts faced an unprecedented spiralling backlog that they'd reached nearly 80,000 outstanding cases by early 2026, leaving victims waiting years for resolution and defendants languishing indefinitely in overcrowded prisons. To alleviate this administrative paralysis, Justice Secretary David Lammy championed reforms that drastically reduced the availability of trial by jury. Very controversial. The bill's central provisions included removing the right of defendants to elect for a jury trial in either way offences, establishing a Crown Court bench division where a single judge tries cases carrying a likely sentence of 3 years or less, and increasing the sentencing powers of magistrates to 18 or 24 months. The removal of jury service for such a vast swathe of the judicial landscape has profound chilling implications for the apportionment of justice, as highlighted the prominent legal advocacy groups such as one called Justice in block capitals, the Criminal Bar Association, check those guys out, and the Law Society, basically a fraternity for everyone who's a solicitor to all be really corrupt. Removing juries strips the system of its democratic legitimacy, its diverse free reasoning, and its ability to reflect the conscience of the community. A single judge bound by strict sentencing council guidelines and operating within a judiciary that is notoriously unrepresentative of the broader public demographic, predominantly older, white, and from privileged educational backgrounds, is far less equipped to navigate the nuanced moral grey areas of the case. In our scenario, of the student with the 5 ecstasy pills, the removal of the jury is catastrophic to the equitable apportionment of justice. So the single judge required by the new legislation, Clause 5, to provide a written, legally sound judgment of conviction or acquittal cannot easily deviate from the rigid legal framework that equates Class A drugs with absolute harm. The judge must treat the pills as instrument of severe criminality, validating the state's prohibitionist stance and tangentially the grieving parent's absolute terror. The scientific data provided by Professor David Nutt regarding the relative safety of the drug and the sociological reality that the student is engaging in normalised youth behaviour are legally inadmissible as mitigating factors against the statute itself. By removing the jury, the conscience of the community, the UK government has arguably streamlined the processing of guilt but severely handicapped the administration of true justice. In contrast, the contrary juxtaposed opinions formed from genuine fact, it is entirely possible to reach a moral, ethical and literal impasse. The jury was the societal algorithm uniquely designed to solve that impasse. But without it, justice ceases to be a reflection of the community's balanced perspective and becomes merely an administrative, punitive reflex of the state. So, statistical metrics of moral ambiguity to fully grasp why justice cannot be a binary, immovable absolute, and to understand the profound hypocrisy inherent in the subjective apportionment of blame, one must look to the ultimate arbiter of objective reality, statistics. The data regarding drug and alcohol mortality in the UK provides a stark, undeniable portrait of how society regulates harm, underscoring the non-binary nature of justice. When we examine the data compiled by the Office of National Statistics and the National Record of Scotland for 3 years, the juxtaposition between the outcomes of legal and illegal substances is jarring. So it's quite a hefty chart. I'm just going to scroll through and show you some of it there. So I'm not going to just pause it and read it slowly. I can't be bothered to read this out. I lost my best friend to a drug overdose. It's not that I don't care. The reading charts takes ages and it makes probably people turn off because it's too boring. But I'll try and leave a link in the description. So that came from the ONS, the NRS. It says lots of people died from alcohol and drugs and stuff. The statistics apparently reveal a profound epidemiological and moral truth. In 2023, the UK recorded 10,400 alcohol-specific deaths, the highest number on record. This equates to a rate of 15.9 deaths per 100,000 people, tearing through communities, overwhelming the NHS with nearly 340,000 alcohol-specific hospital admissions and devastating tens of thousands of families. Furthermore, alcohol mortality is deeply entwined with the socio-economic deprivation. In Scotland, alcohol-specific mortality rates were 4 to 5 times as high in the most depraved areas compared to the least deprived areas in 2024. In stark contrast, the total drug poisoning deaths in England and Wales for 2024 stood at 5,600. Of these deaths, 3,736 were identified specifically as drug misuse. So the vast majority of these tragic fatalities were driven by opiates such as heroin, fentanyl and nitazines, as well as cocaine. Deaths specifically mentioning MDMA hover historically around 60 to 80 per year, representing a statistical anomaly given the millions of doses consumed annually by the British public. Research indicates that the risk of a fatal incident per user is estimated at 1 in 20,000 for ecstasy and 1 in 9,000 for drinkers. So very different. Yet how does the justice system and broader society process these metrics? The 10,000 alcohol deaths are largely internalised by the state and the public as an accessible, albeit tragic, cost of cognitive liberty, economic commerce and cultural tradition. A supermarket manager who largely sells the vodka that ultimately destroys the liver, or a bartender who serves drinks that induce fatal acute alcohol poisoning, is never charged with manslaughter, nor are they viewed as a menace to society. Their intent is not commerce, not murder. His intent was to make money, not to relieve somebody of their life, The state collects immense tax revenues from this transaction, integrating the harm into the foundational economics of the nation. But when an MDMA pill claims a life representing less than 0.7 of the total deaths caused by alcohol, the entire punitive apparatus of the state is mobilised. Tragedy is amplified by the media, the grief of the family is agonisingly publicised, and the legal system seeks absolute devastating retribution against anyone found in the supply chain, up to and including 19-year-old law student holding a bag of 5 pills for them and their mates. These statistics are not presented to invalidate the profound pain of those who have lost loved ones to ecstasy, to a mother burying a child. It matters not at all whether the lethal chemical was an opiate, a legally purchased alcoholic beverage, or a rogue contaminated MDMA tablet. The devastation is total, infinite, and commands the highest degree of societal empathy and respect. However, these statistics serve as a vital, undeniable metric for the non-binary, ambiguous nature of the apportionment of justice. They prove unequivocally that the law does not punish based on objective mathematical harm, nor does it regulate based on pure scientific physics. So in conclusion, the subjective canvas of jurisprudence. The exploration of MDMA and alcohol reveals that justice is not a fixed point on a moral compass. Rather, the apportionment of justice is a constantly shifting reflection of circumstantial narrative and personal subjective bias. We punish the young law student caught with 5 MDMA pills not because the pills are demonstrably the most dangerous substances in our society. The data vehemently disprove this, but because our cultural narrative, heavily influenced by historical prohibition and media amplification, has designated them as an unacceptable risk. We excuse the alcohol purveyor because our cultural narrative relies on their product, ignoring the mountain of corpses it generates annually. When the justice system functions at its highest democratic ideal, it relies on diverse, empathetic deliberation of a jury to navigate these impossible contradictions. It requires the conscience of the community to weigh in the cold, empirical reality of Professor David Nutt's harm matrices against the searing, entirely valid grief of a devastated parent and the empirical vacuum of the supplier. As the United Kingdom moves into a new era under the Courts and Tribunals Act in 2026, opting for the administrative expediency of judge-alone trials over the democratic consciences of the jury, it risks losing the very mechanism that makes justice human and adaptable. In the end, justice cannot be a binary, immovable absolute. It's a fragile negotiation between science of what is, the tragic reality of what's been lost, and the subjective bias of the society that must ultimately live with the outcome. Understanding this profound malleability is not a failure of law, but the first necessary step towards a truly equitable, respectful and intellectually honest jurisprudence.